International news now.
So today we want to talk about at least 3 sets of events that have occurred in the Syrian conflict over the past week. First, last week President Trump continued to publicly press the military and the Defense Department to begin preparations to withdraw American troops from Syria. He began this public conversation almost 2 weeks ago with some impromptu remarks at a rally in Ohio that the United States would be withdrawing its troops from Syria soon.
And by the way, we're knocking the hell out of ISIS. We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now. Very soon. Very soon we're coming out. We're going to have 100% of the caliphate, as they call it, sometimes referred to as land. We're taking it all back quickly. But we're going to be coming out of there real soon. Going to get back to our country, where we belong, where we want to be.
The next day, Friday, March 30th, President Trump ordered the State Department to suspend $200 million in relief efforts for Syria designed to foster economic stabilization and recovery there. Then last Tuesday, President Trump reiterated his desire to pull American troops out of Syria during a news conference at the White House.
Where Syria is concerned, our primary mission in terms of that was getting rid of ISIS. We've almost completed that task, and we'll be making a decision very quickly in coordination with others in the area.
So you're inclined to pull the troops out?
I want to get out. I want to bring our troops back home. I want to start rebuilding our nation. We will have, as of 3 months ago, $7 trillion in the Middle East over the last 17 years. We get nothing out of it.
These announcements surprised the military and prompted a rush to try and get the president to walk back his public pronouncements and delay the withdrawal of American troops. The latest reports indicate that the military has talked the president out of an immediate withdrawal of American troops from Syria. However, there was a tacit agreement in which the president signed off on keeping American troops in Syria for less than a year. So they'd be there for months, not years. Second, on Saturday, over 40 people were killed in a chemical weapons attack in Douma, Syria, outside of Damascus. The deaths and injuries were consistent with poisoning by chlorine gas. Observers state that barrel bombs were dropped out of helicopters in these neighborhoods in Douma. Doctors, international relief agencies, the United States and its allies have all accused the Syrian government of these attacks. Syria and Russia denied that they occurred. And these attacks have escalated domestic pressure on the president to respond against Syria with a new military strike. And yesterday, Senator McCain, a Republican from Arizona, charged that President Trump's public support for withdrawing American troops last week contributed to these attacks by emboldening the Syrian government. Third, early Monday morning, Israel launched a series of missiles from planes flying over Lebanese airspace against military installations in Syria. Some of the soldiers killed at these bases were advisors or members of the Iranian army. So we're going to watch a quick video now to get an overview of all these developments, and then we'll come back and talk about them.
Crisis over the latest reported chemical weapons attack by Syria's government against its own people is escalating amid growing international outrage and threats of retaliation. Russia's military claims Israeli fighter jets attacked a Syrian government airbase overnight. The UN Security Council plans an emergency meeting this afternoon.
The bombing that used a possible chlorine agent happened over the weekend in the town of Douma outside of Damascus. More than 40 people, including women and children, are reported dead.
On Twitter, President Trump called out Russian President Vladimir Putin and Iran for backing Syria's ruling regime and warned they would pay, in his words, a big price. Holly Williams is following this unfolding story from Istanbul, Turkey. Holly, good morning.
Good morning. This alleged chemical bombardment comes as the Syrian regime attacks eastern Ghouta, the last stronghold of Syrian rebels close to the country's capital, Damascus. And we should warn you that the videos emerging from the town of Douma in eastern Ghouta, where this alleged chemical attack took place, involve children and are very graphic.
The videos show lifeless bodies with no visible injuries. All of them seem to be inside buildings. Survivors struggling to breathe, many of them children, and being washed down, apparently to remove a substance from their skin. We cannot independently verify any of these videos, and we don't know whether a chemical weapon was used. Survivors, though, reportedly smelled of chlorine, a chemical that can be deadly in confined spaces.
We received many patients who suffered from symptoms compatible with exposure to chlorine gas, high concentration chlorine gas.
Chlorine is thought to have been widely used as a weapon in Syria's 7-year-long civil war. But as the Syrian regime assaults eastern Ghouta, it's once again denied using chemical weapons. An attack in Ghouta in 2013 killed hundreds with a much more deadly substance, sarin nerve agent. Under international pressure, the Syrian regime agreed to hand over its chemical weapons stockpile, but the deal didn't include chlorine. Another sarin attack almost exactly a year ago killed scores of people in the town of Han Shaihoun in northern Syria, blamed by the US and UN investigators on the Syrian regime. The US responded with missile strikes on a regime airbase, nearly 60 Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting aircraft and ammo dumps.
If this was in fact a chlorine attack, and if investigations find that the Syrian regime was responsible, the question is whether this will draw an international response. John.
Holly Williams for us in Istanbul. Thank you, Holly.
All right, let me say one thing before getting into the discussion about the international response. The Syrian government was trying to root out one of the last strongholds of rebels against the government in this town of Douma. And this chemical attack actually had its desired result, because right after that chemical attack, the rebels have negotiated some sort of settlement in which they are either going to accept peaceful coexistence with the government and stay, or they're going to get on buses and leave to other rebel-held regions. And so one of the problems here is, along with many others that we're going to talk about, is that this sort of attack actually worked for the Syrian government in the sense of achieving its primary military objectives.
Which was to break the will of resistance in the suburb, right? And so yesterday they were busing people out after this deal was cut.
And so keep that in mind. Okay, so as this video makes clear, the use of chemical weapons in this conflict is not new. Prior use by the Syrian government nearly provoked wider American military intervention into this war by the Obama administration back in 2013. So we want to give you some of the backstory now, because as President Trump justifiably charges now, that history has contributed to the challenges facing the international community and the United States concerning whether and how to respond to the potential use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government now, right? So first we need to point out that there is a strong set of international norms and institutions against the use of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, right? They are all considered weapons of mass destruction. Consequently, the use of such weapons, particularly when they target civilians, is often interpreted as crossing the boundaries of normal or acceptable forms of warfare, right? And so there's a rule out there, an international institution against the use of chemical weapons, and Syria has violated that. So remember, President Bush used these norms against the use of weapons of mass destruction to build domestic support in the United States for the war in Iraq. Saddam was a dictator. He had weapons of mass destruction. He had already used them against his own civilians. In the post-9/11 period, the United States could not tolerate the possession of weapons of mass destruction by dictators that might use them or give them to terrorists. For all these reasons, the United States needed to use military force to remove Saddam from power and democratize Iraq, according to the Bush administration. Second, the world thought that the Syrian government no longer possessed chemical weapons. They were supposedly, the chemical weapons that were in Syria were supposedly transferred out of Syria or destroyed after a Russian-brokered political compromise back in 2013. However, the repeated use of weapons with chlorine gas since that time, have revealed an underappreciated component of that agreement. That agreement did not apply to Syria's stockpiles of chlorine gas. Third, Syria has done this before, used chemical weapons in 2013. The Assad government launched even worse attacks back then that killed over 1,400 people. Moreover, they launched these attacks after President Obama had warned Syria that its use of chemical weapons would be an unacceptable escalation of the Syrian civil war. This threat, and then the political decision in the United States not to execute that threat, continues to shape American policy. And this is a huge debate and a crucial point to be made. So let's now look at how the United States responded to this potential for the use of chemical weapons in Syria back in 2012 and 2013, because it matters for what's happening now. And we're going to watch two clips in a row from the PBS news program FRONTLINE. The first describes the red line statement that President Obama made publicly in 2012, warning the Assad regime not to use chemical weapons and stating that that would cross a red line for him. The second clip describes the fallout from the attacks by Syria in 2013. So let's run those now.
With no one to stop him, Assad initiated a new phase in the war: the deployment of chemical weapons.
The Assad regime calculated that their use of chemical weapons would strike terror in the hearts of the civilians and would ultimately rob the rebel forces of the civilian populace in which it needed to operate in. So it was very calculated, and it was very shrewd, and was very, very cynical.
A few months earlier, the president was holding a routine press conference about campaign finance, Medicare, and Afghanistan. Then came the last question of the day.
Chuck Todd.
Mr. President, update us on your latest thinking on where you think things are in Syria, and in particular, whether you envision using U.S. military.
In his response, President Obama brought up Assad's prospective use of chemical weapons.
We have been very clear to the Assad regime that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus. That would change my equation.
That was not apparently a planned thing. He said it in response to a question from a reporter who was asking about the use of chemical weapons.
And that there would be enormous consequences if we start seeing movement on the chemical weapons front.
Some of the aides, in fact, who heard him say this were surprised. They didn't know where that phrase had come from.
Thank you, everybody.
Then, a sarin gas attack on a rebel-held suburb of Damascus. Sarin is a nerve agent that causes lung muscle paralysis and results in death from suffocation.
"1,400 men, women, and children are killed, according to what the American intelligence agencies tell the president." At this point, the president can't ignore it. He has to have some sort of response. He has drawn this red line. He may be trapped by it, but he understands that his credibility and the credibility of the United States are on the line.
The indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, the killing of women and children and innocent bystanders by chemical weapons is a moral obscenity. President Obama believes there must be accountability for those who would use the world's most heinous weapons against the world's most vulnerable people.
The president ordered the military to get ready.
A couple of points. First, the Red Line ultimatum was an unscripted response to a reporter's question rather than a prepared statement that was debated and crafted by President Obama and his advisors. As the clip states, the language about a red line and the threat to use force in response to the use of chemical weapons by Assad took President Obama's advisors by surprise. But it should be noted that the Obama administration did not walk back from the threat in the days and weeks following this statement. It would be a full year before these words would prompt the U.S. potentially to action. It was Assad's use of a sarin gas attack outside of Damascus in August of 2013 that would really bring the Red Line comment from 2012 back into relevance. This attack was not the first reported use of chemical weapons by Assad. The Obama administration claimed that Assad had used chemical weapons in June of 2013 as well, and this prompted military activities, including sending arms to Syrian rebels. But that was held up by Congress, which was worried about vetting the rebels receiving U.S. military aid. The larger scale attack in August of 2013 that resulted in 1,400 deaths and videos of the carnage shown on YouTube increased pressure on the Obama administration to respond based on his earlier statement from 2012 that any use of chemical weapons would be met by a U.S. military response. Within days, President Obama commanded the military to draw up plans for a military strike against Syria, and Secretary of State John Kerry reiterated the threat that the U.S. would strike militarily in response to Assad's use of chemical weapons. Now, after this initial escalation towards military intervention, the 2013 crisis hit a second phase when President Obama, in an apparent change of heart, requested congressional authorization for the use of force. He sought to secure and get congressional buy-in and avoid the political costs of taking these actions alone. We have a clip again from Frontline that chronicles this development, so let's run that clip.
But Obama's having second thoughts. He's feeling alone. His friends in Britain say, yes, we're with you, but then Parliament says, no, we're not.
It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
It was a Friday night, and I got a call from the President of the United States, and he said to me, I am considering an alternative course of action, and he wanted me overnight to consider whether a delay would in any way affect our ability to be effective with our military options.
The next morning, Obama summoned his longtime foreign policy advisor, now Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough.
And he goes for a walk on the South Lawn with McDonough, and they circle this pathway again and again and again for 45 minutes talking about what to do. And the president tells him, I've got this idea. Why don't we go to Congress and ask them to approve a strike? What he's looking for is buy-in.
As near as we can tell, he worried that he didn't have sufficient political support for what might be a long-running conflict.
The president was looking for a way to not have to make good on the threat that he had made. I think because the president, having drawn that red line, realized that he had no appetite for direct military engagement in Syria.
So he comes back in from this walk with Dennis McDonough, and he tells some of his other advisors, and they can't believe what they're hearing. This is a crazy idea as far as they're concerned. If you go to Congress, they tell him, and you lose a vote like this, it would be devastating to your political standing. And they pushed back, and he held firm.
A few hours later, the president called a press conference in the Rose Garden.
After careful deliberation, I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets. But having made my decision as Commander-in-Chief based on what I am convinced is our national security interests, I will seek authorization for the use of force from the American people's representatives in Congress.
At the time, he was describing it as seeking strong political support for this decisive move. He had all the rhetoric of action, but in truth it was stepping back from the imminent attack that was ahead. You know, it was all in motion, and at the last minute, the president blinked.
I was there in southern Turkey at that time, and I can tell you that the Syrian people were looking at the skies, hoping that the United States Air Force would come to the rescue. And then all of a sudden, on September 1st, the Syrian people woke up and realized that the United States was not going to come to the rescue.
Not only did the Syrians believe this, the French armed forces were mobilizing. They were ready to go ahead, and they stopped at the last minute when they heard that the president is going to ask for congressional authorization.
I mean, this is, in some ways, the riskiest decision, certainly in foreign policy, that he's made of his presidency. And he's put his credibility in the hands of a Congress that doesn't like him.
So as the clip suggests, President Obama has second thoughts about deploying force unilaterally after the British House of Commons surprisingly refuses to support military intervention in Syria. Arguably, this suggests rather weak international support for American intervention, and also hints that mass publics may not support another war in the Middle East. So in order to avoid being politically isolated on this issue and having to take all the political responsibility for initiating military action in Syria, Obama goes to Congress for authorization. This accomplishes two things, according to the observers in the clip. First, it slows down the process and leaves an opening to avoid military intervention altogether. Second, if military action goes forward, the president will have congressional support and, more importantly, shared congressional responsibility for the intervention. Of course, the danger was that Congress could vote President Obama down, which would have been a huge blow to his international and domestic status and his political power. So, was this action that of a president firm in his belief to go to war over the use of chemical weapons and simply looking for congressional buy-in to bolster the legitimacy of his action? Or was this the action of a president with second thoughts, looking for a way out of using military force and thus hoping that Congress would say no, as the House of Commons said no to its Prime Minister, David Cameron? Whatever the case, the debate in Congress signaled that the president did not have the votes, particularly in the House of Representatives, to get congressional authorization. And it effectively took American military intervention in Syria to punish the Assad regime for that violation of Obama's red line. It took that option off the table. And so we see here how congressional action over the use of military force can constrain the use of military force. Right? Congressional opposition prevents substantial American military intervention into the Syrian war in 2013.
All right. So then there was another turn. I mean, this was quite a drama, actually. The 2013 crisis took this third unexpected turn when Secretary of State John Kerry inadvertently gave Syria a way to avoid airstrikes if it gave up all of its chemical weapons. And so Senator Kerry was asked a question about how they could possibly avoid it, and he just threw out this, well, if they just gave up all their chemical weapons, then maybe, right? And so spokespersons for the Obama administration would later clarify that Kerry was speaking in a hypothetical, but some would also claim that the statement was a flyer, some sort of trial balloon, if you will, to see if it would get a positive response from Syria and its patron, Russia. And it did. Almost immediately, Russia seized on Kerry's statement and gets President Assad of Syria to agree to this condition of getting rid of their stockpile of chemical weapons in order to avoid military strikes. The Obama administration responds embracing the Russian initiative, even though it expressed some doubt and mistrust of both Russia as the broker of the deal and of Syria's willingness to follow through on this deal of removing chemical weapons from their possession. Nevertheless, President Obama seems to have had very few other options at his disposal, again, going back to Professor McDonald's point, because Congress was unlikely to support his proposal to use force anyway. So the Obama administration accepts the Russian initiative and avoids potential negative congressional vote and use of force. So the crisis sort of winds down without any military action. Russia and Syria follow through on the deal, and Syria gives up its chemical weapons, except for the chlorine gas, which, you know, how did that slip through, I don't know, and allows UN inspectors to verify the execution of this deal. So this seemingly positive ending in 2013, the use of American military threats to force Syria to give up its chemical weapons, produced conflicting perspectives on the overall political implications of this crisis about Syrian chemical weapons attacks back in 2013. Some argued that the process, despite being messy, produced a very positive outcome in the end. President Assad supposedly gave up his chemical weapons, something that military airstrikes were probably not going to achieve at the time. On the other side, critics argued that the process and outcome resulted in the United States losing credibility and some moral authority because it did not follow through on its threat to use force when it said it would in response to chemical weapons. I think Vice President Joe Biden said, "Superpowers don't bluff," was his line. And he, you know, there's consequences to saying you're going to do something and then not, especially if you're the United States. So these arguments hold that the failure to execute such a threat sends a very dangerous signal to others. Now, we also now know that the agreement did not apply, as we said, to weapons with chlorine gas. And we also know that the Syrian government has continued to use chemical weapons. And so what looked like a pretty good outcome back in 2013 is increasingly looking like a not so good outcome in 2018. The agreement also reduced American military pressure on the Assad regime, and the Assad regime remains in power today and is more entrenched than ever, really. And that was arguably a missed opportunity to perhaps extract Assad from power. So this now brings us up to the current situation and the current burning question. What should President Trump do in response to these chemical weapons attacks of Saturday?
So first we want to talk about the connections between the decision back in 2013 not to strike with the strategic situation facing the United States today. Note some of the comments from opposition leaders in the Frontline clip. Syrian opposition saw 2013 and the strategic situation in 2013 as an opportunity to defeat Assad by getting Western military intervention. The U.S., the French, the British intervention had been taken off the table, but this was a chance to turn the tide in the Syrian civil war and potentially knock Assad out of power. And so this opens up the larger question. If President Obama had gone in 2013 and hit back for the chemical weapons attacks, could this have strengthened the rebels that eventually would have then knocked Assad out of power? And this is significant, right, because 2013 occurs before both Russia heavily intervenes in support of the Assad regime with military aid and military force in 2014. And this occurs before Iran really gets entrenched there. And so one of the things to think about here, and this is part of the Trump critique of Obama now that's been played out over the last week or two, is the United States might have lost a golden opportunity to alter the strategic dynamic in 2013, get Assad out. And by getting Assad out, you would have deprived both Russia and Iran a toehold or a foothold in the region, which has really grown in the last couple of years.
And one thing to note about the difference between 2013 and now is this lack of Russian military intervention. There were not Russian troops on the ground in Syria in 2013. And so there wasn't this risk that an attack on assets in Syria could somehow inadvertently hit Russian military assets and cause an escalation of the war. This was in a very different strategic environment then. It was just Syria still without these international actors like Iran and Russia on the ground in a serious way.
And note the dynamics on this. So yesterday, the possibility has been raised over the last 2 days that the U.S. will launch a military strike against Syria in retaliation for these attacks. Russia issues a statement yesterday trying to deter the United States, saying this will have bad consequences, saying don't escalate this because you might force us to respond. And so now there's a new exchange of threats, right? This isn't just about the U.S. threatening the Assad regime anymore. Now we have Russia threatening the United States if it responds. And this is the difference from 2013 because you didn't have Russia as a player back in.
Right. And then if you throw in the Israeli attack on Iranian assets, you see how complicated it is now, especially with any really serious military strike. You have to be really surgical and pretty limited in order to keep it from escalating into a conflict that would involve Russia and Iran, as well as the Syrian government. That wasn't the case back in 2013.
Let's make this point as well. And Rob brought this up yesterday when we were preparing for the lecture. The other thing about this deal that is brokered by the Russians in 2013 is it effectively invites the Russian government to be a participant in this peace and political process. And so, in a sense, it empowered them to support their Syrian ally, and they then used that to continue to prop up Assad and strengthen their hold in the region since then.
And so that was the beginning of the Russian intervention. Now, I would not make the case that Russia intervenes because of this crisis. I mean, Russia didn't have to intervene. It took a bold act in putting Russian troops in the region, but the signals really do matter here. And this is what's really interesting and difficult about a situation like this, right? In 2013, if you look and read some of the statements of President Obama, he thought that this was one of his best foreign policy decisions. He said, look, he turned the narrative around, according to Obama. He said, we always use military force. We changed that narrative, and we achieved the outcome we wanted. We wanted to get the chemical weapons out of Syria, and we did without firing a shot, and military intervention wouldn't have accomplished that goal. And we also avoided, all of the bad repercussions of military intervention. But now, in 2018, when Syria doesn't seem to be deterred by threats, seems to be more emboldened, continued to use chemical weapons, that decision and that outcome looks much less salutary than it did back in 2013. There were real, and even on both sides of the aisle, some sort of grudging acknowledgement, well, it looks like they got, perhaps luckily got what they wanted, but it turned out that they didn't get what they wanted. Syria is still an actor that uses chemical weapons and has chemical weapons to use.